paradrama tales.
Two cops laughed and took photos as I bled out on the street, calling me a worthless hooker who deserved it and making me crawl to their patrol car. They had no idea I was an undercover prosecutor and that this night would end their careers. I had spent the last 6 months living a double life, walking streets most people would never dare to set foot on, wearing clothes I'd never wear in my real life, speaking in a voice that wasn't my own. It was all part of the role, an undercover prosecutor in the Special Prosecutions Unit, embedded in a trafficking ring to gather evidence from the inside. Every conversation, every meeting, every glance over my shoulder was calculated. I had learned their names, their patterns, their routines, all while pretending to be one of their girls. It was dangerous work, but I believed in it. I believed in the women I'd met along the way, the ones who didn't have a choice, the ones who'd been broken and discarded by a system that saw them as nothing more than statistics. I knew the risks. I'd been trained for them, but nothing could have prepared me for the night my cover would cost me blood. That night had started like so many others, me in my disguise walking the edge of a dimly lit block, scanning faces and cars, listening for whispers about new shipments coming in. My wire was taped beneath my dress, pressed against my ribs like a silent ally. The air was heavy, the streetlights humming, the shadows stretching just far enough to hide the wrong kind of men. I had made contact with one of my targets earlier that evening, hoping to draw him into a conversation about an upcoming delivery. But before I could steer it in the direction I needed, something went wrong. A flash of steel, a sharp heat tearing through my abdomen, and the sudden suffocating realization that I had been stabbed. I remember stumbling backward, clutching my side, feeling the warm rush of blood soaking my dress. My attacker melted into the night before I could even register his face. The street was empty, the windows above shuttered. I had no choice but to crawl toward the main road, each movement sending fire through my body. I kept my hand pressed hard against the wound, telling myself I just had to make it far enough for someone to see me. When I finally heard the low rumble of an approaching patrol car, relief flooded through me so quickly, it almost drowned the pain. I thought help had come. But when the two uniforms stepped out, that hope evaporated. Officer Howard's eyes scanned me up and down, and instead of concern, I saw only contempt. Brooks leaned casually against the patrol car, stretching like we were inconveniencing him. They didn't ask my name, didn't reach for their radios to call an ambulance. Howard smirked and muttered, "Another hooker got herself stabbed," like it was a line he'd used 100 times before. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. My legs shook as I struggled to stand, but neither of them moved to help. In that moment, I was still just a role to them, a woman they could dismiss, a life they could write off. They had no idea that beneath the blood, beneath the dress, beneath the disguise, I was one of their own. They had no idea the wire pressed against my ribs was recording every cruel word, every second of their deliberate neglect. They didn't know it yet, but their arrogance that night would become the very thing that destroyed them. Howard's voice was the first signal that something was very wrong. I'd expected urgency, maybe even anger at the attacker who'd left me bleeding, but instead, his tone was dripping with disdain. "What did you expect working these streets?" he asked, as if I'd just told him the weather report, and not that I was dying in front of him. Brooks, still leaning on the patrol car, joined in with a smirk, mocking my plea for help in a high-pitched voice like a schoolyard bully. Each word felt like a slap, an intentional reminder that in their eyes, I wasn't worth the effort it would take to walk the 10 feet between us. I pressed my palm harder against the wound, feeling the hot stickiness seep between my fingers, and forced myself upright. If they wouldn't come to me, I'd go to them. The more I moved, the clearer it became that they weren't simply apathetic, they were enjoying this. Howard made me repeat my name 3 times, as if savoring my struggle to speak through the pain, while Brooks tossed a filthy rag at me from the gutter, telling me to apply pressure if I wasn't too high. The disgust in their eyes wasn't just personal, it was systemic, the kind that comes from years of looking at certain people as less than human. I had seen that look before in my work, but never directed at me. And yet, in this moment, they didn't see the prosecutor, the trained operative. They saw only the character I'd been playing, and they hated her. Their comments turned uglier, drifting into lazy cliches about girls like me, ruining neighborhoods, lowering property values, endangering kids. They spoke about me as if I weren't there, as if my blood pooling on the concrete was just part of the scenery. The air felt heavy with something more dangerous than my injury complacency. This wasn't a one-off. This was routine for them. The way they spoke, the ease with which they dismissed my existence, told me they'd done this before and expected to do it again. My vision began to tunnel, black creeping in from the edges. The pain in my side had gone from burning to icy, my body's way of warning me I didn't have much time. Somewhere in the haze, I heard Brooks say something about rats and junkies stripping my body before morning. Howard chuckled, agreeing. The words might have broken someone else, but for me, they became an anchor. I made a choice right there, not just to survive, but to remember. To memorize every word, every gesture, every deliberate second they wasted while my life slipped away. And then, with one violent convulsion, my body betrayed me. The wire tape beneath my dress for 6 months tore loose and fell onto the pavement. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The label on the device caught the light, property of DA's Office Special Prosecutions Unit, and the air between us shifted. Howard's smirk vanished. Brooks stopped mid-sentence. Confusion gave way to horror as they realized exactly who I was. In that instant, the game changed, but the damage they'd done was already etched into my memory, and soon it would be recorded for the world to hear. The moment their eyes locked on the wire, the bravado drained from their faces. Howard took a step back, like he'd just touched a live wire himself, muttering, "Oh God," under his breath. Brooks's voice cracked when he whispered, "The trafficking prosecutor," as if saying it aloud made it more dangerous. For a fleeting second, I thought the revelation might spur them into action, that maybe the shame of realizing who I was would override their contempt. But instead of rushing to help, they hesitated, calculating, weighing their options. Every second of that delay felt like another deliberate choice, another reminder that my life was negotiable to them. The pain in my abdomen throbbed with every shallow breath, but I forced myself to keep my eyes open to watch them, to memorize every detail. Howard finally reached for his radio, his voice clipped and formal, as he called for medical assistance, carefully omitting any mention of his earlier working girl assumptions. Brooks avoided my gaze, pulling on a pair of gloves and pretending to check my pulse while digging his thumb cruelly into my wound. Still ticking, he muttered as though survival was an inconvenience. When the paramedics arrived, Howard's demeanor had shifted entirely. He stood straighter, used my title when speaking to them, and even tried to insert himself into the narrative, as if he'd been the one to save me. I wanted to call him out, to spit the truth, right there on the sidewalk, but I was too weak. My body had gone cold, my hands numb, my grip on consciousness slipping with each passing second. The last thing I remember before the world went black was the paramedics lifting me onto a stretcher, Howard's eyes darting nervously toward the wire, now in their custody. Waking up in the hospital was disorienting. Harsh lights, the smell of antiseptic, the steady beep of machines keeping track of the fact that I was still alive. The surgeon explained that the blade had missed major organs by millimeters, that I'd lost a dangerous amount of blood, but was lucky. I didn't feel lucky. I felt violated not just by the attacker who stabbed me, but by the two men sworn to protect me, who had chosen cruelty over compassion. The detectives from Internal Affairs arrived not long after. They asked me to recount everything from the moment I crawled onto the street to the instant Brooks read the inscription on my recording device. I gave it to them in painstaking detail, my voice steady even when describing the worst of it. They listened without interrupting, their pens scratching furiously across their notepads. When I finished the lead, Detective assured me the wire had captured everything in crystal clarity. Every insult, every joke about letting me die, every casual remark about rats and dumpsters. I lay there afterwards staring at the ceiling, realizing that my fight wasn't over. It had only shifted. I'd gone from undercover operative to key witness in a case that could dismantle more than just the reputations of two corrupt cops. This was going to be war, and I had no intention of losing. The first time I heard the wire recording played back, it was like reliving the stabbing all over again. Only now I was hearing it as an observer, detached from the pain, but consumed by the rage it reignited. Howard's voice was cold and dismissive, every word dripping with the kind of contempt that doesn't come from a single bad day but from years of dehumanizing people. Brooks's mocking tone, the fake high-pitched imitation of my plea for help, landed like fresh blows. There was no room for them to claim misunderstanding, no context that could soften the impact. The recording didn't just catch their words, it caught the timing, the laughter, the deliberate pauses while I bled. Internal Affairs knew they had gold. But in law enforcement, even gold isn't enough to guarantee justice. Almost immediately, the pushback began. The union attorneys argued the comments were taken out of context, that the photos Brooks took were for crime scene documentation, that the delay in aid was due to protocol for unknown subjects who may be intoxicated. It was the same tired playbook I'd seen used to protect bad cops before rewrite the narrative, sow doubt, and hope the public's attention drifts elsewhere. But this time, I had the truth and the scars to keep the focus sharp. My supervisor backed me fully, and so did the IA detectives, though they warned me it would get ugly. They were right. Within days, the intimidation started. The first was a late-night call from a blocked number, a voice telling me they knew where I lived, and that it would be safer for me to drop the complaint. I reported it immediately, and patrol cars began circling my block more often. But we all knew it was a bandage on a deeper wound. Then came the physical reminders. My tires slashed in my building's secure garage. Dead flowers left at my door. A crude message spray-painted on my parking spot. I documented everything, forwarded it to IA, and refused to be rattled in front of them. But inside, I felt the walls closing in. My mother, who had already flown in to care for me, doubled down, installing cameras, new locks, even a door brace, while I protested that I didn't need a fortress. Truthfully, part of me was grateful for her relentlessness. What they didn't expect was that their harassment wouldn't scare me into silence, it would fuel me. The more they pushed, the more determined I became to see this through. I met quietly with other officers, good ones, who told me they'd seen Howard and Brooks act the same way toward other women, but had never spoken up, afraid of backlash. Slowly, courage spread. Luca, a young patrol officer, came forward officially with her own account of Brooks taking inappropriate photos at scenes. 3 more followed, each story fitting into the same ugly pattern. By the time IA finished compiling statements, the case was no longer just about me. It was about a culture of contempt and abuse that had been allowed to fester for years. And with every page of evidence, with every victim willing to speak, I knew that the night they left me to die had set something bigger in motion, something they could no longer stop. Once the statements from other officers and victims started stacking up, the investigation shifted into high gear. Internal Affairs wasn't just looking at Howard and Brooks anymore, they were peeling back layers of rot that had been festering inside the department for years. Search warrants were issued for both of their homes, and what they found was worse than even I had imagined. Brooks' devices were loaded with hundreds of photos, many showing victims in vulnerable or dying moments, including several of me bleeding on the street. The metadata proved those images were taken while I was waiting for help, destroying his claim that they were crime scene documentation. Howard's computer wasn't much cleaner, emails mocking victims, bragging about making one crawl to the patrol car, and laughing about cleaning up the streets in ways that sounded more like cruelty than law enforcement. The union fought back hard, throwing every legal maneuver they could find into the mixed motions to suppress evidence claims. The searches were flawed arguments about context. But the combination of the wire recording the photo metadata and the growing list of witnesses was a wall they couldn't scale. Still, their desperation made them dangerous. The harassment escalated. Cars followed me. When I left home, sometimes switching out vehicles mid-route to make it harder to track. I'd get anonymous calls at all hours, sometimes silence, sometimes a low voice, promising I'd regret what I was doing. Luca and the other officers who'd stepped forward faced their own retaliation. Threatening notes left on windshields, cryptic warnings in locker rooms, the kind of quiet intimidation designed to break resolve without leaving a mark. We created our own informal network, checking and daily sharing details of suspicious encounters and making sure no one felt isolated. It was strange forming a kind of underground support group within a police department, but it was the only way to keep going. The breakthrough came from an unexpected angle. Brooks's friend in Vice, the one known for collecting photos, got himself arrested on unrelated charges. Facing a long prison sentence, he decided to talk. What he revealed was a network of officers who had been sharing and storing degrading images of victims for years using a hidden server. He gave IA the location and passwords, and when the tech team cracked it open, they found thousands of files spanning more than a decade. It wasn't just Howard and Brooks, it was 12 officers across 3 precincts. That was the moment I knew this was bigger than revenge or personal justice. This was about exposing an entire system of abuse. And yet, as satisfying as the evidence was, I also understood what it meant. Howard and Brooks weren't going to roll over. They'd fight harder, and their allies would do the same. But by then, fear had stopped dictating my choices. I'd survived the night they tried to let me die. I could survive their last desperate attempts to silence me. And now, I had the truth and an army of voices to make sure they never got the chance to do it again. The trials came faster than I'd expected, but by then, I was ready. I'd spent months preparing, going over every detail of that night, memorizing timelines, reviewing the evidence so many times I could recite it in my sleep. Howard took a deal before it ever reached a jury, pleading guilty to reduce charges in exchange for information about decades of corruption. It was a bitter pill, knowing he'd served less time than he deserved, but his confession pulled back the curtain on a culture that had been protected for far too long. Brooks, on the other hand, decided to fight. He sat in court like he still believed the badge could shield him, his lawyer spinning the same tired excuses. Crime scene documentation, misinterpreted jokes following procedure. But when the prosecutor played the wire recording, every smug defense collapsed. His voice filled the courtroom, mocking me, dismissing my life, laughing about leaving me to die. No cross-examination could erase that. When the guilty verdict came, Brooks barely looked up, but I held his gaze until the deputies let him out in cuffs. 15 years in prison. Howard got 8 and lost his pension. Both would be registered as violent offenders. It wasn't just about the sentences, it was about the fact that they'd been held accountable at all. That in itself sent a shockwave through the department. The ripple effects were immediate. More victims came forward, their complaints finally taken seriously. Officers implicated in the photo-sharing ring were suspended or resigned under investigation. The Vice unit underwent a complete overhaul with civilian oversight now embedded in its structure. Training protocols for handling vulnerable victims were rewritten not just on paper, but in practice. Luca was promoted to detective, her voice carrying weight in reform meetings that, months earlier, she wouldn't even have been invited to attend. Outside the department, the trafficking ring I'd infiltrated was gone. 35 arrests, 28 convictions, and countless women freed from the nightmare that had defined their lives. Some of them reached out to me, thanking me for not giving up. I didn't tell them that their survival had been part of what kept me going too. Still, victory didn't erase the cost. The scar across my abdomen ached whenever the weather turned cold. Sleep was a fragile thing. One unexpected noise in the night, and my pulse would spike my mind back in that alley with the blade and the laughter. I checked locks obsessively, kept my phone within reach at all times, and still caught myself scanning crowds for familiar faces. Recovery wasn't about going back to who I'd been before, it was about learning to live with who I'd become. And who I'd become was someone unwilling to let fear or corruption dictate the rules. Howard and Brooks had wanted me to disappear quietly. Instead, their cruelty had ignited a reckoning that would outlast their prison terms. I'd survived them. And I was still here, still fighting, making sure the next time someone bled in the street, the people sworn to protect them wouldn't look the other way. 1 year after the night they left me to die, I walked into court not as a victim, but as the lead prosecutor on a new trafficking case. The weight of that transformation wasn't lost on me. I had stood in this same courthouse before, bleeding internally, my name being dragged through the mud by defense attorneys who wanted to twist my suffering into a liability. Now, I stood in front of the bench with my head high, my case files in order, and a team that trusted me. Howard and Brooks were both behind bars, their badges long gone, their reputations reduced to cautionary tales whispered in the halls of the department. The reforms their actions had unintentionally set in motion were still in progress. But the shift was undeniable, complaints were being heard. Oversight was real, and the idea that a badge could shield cruelty was no longer taken for granted. The scar across my abdomen tugged slightly under my blouse as I addressed the court, a constant reminder of the cost of change. I had learned to live with it, not as something to hide, but as proof that I had endured. My days were still shaped by caution, double-checking locks, scanning streets as I walked, but they were also shaped by purpose. The women freed from the trafficking ring had faces, names, and futures now, and that mattered more than any lingering fear. I still met with Luca once a month, usually over coffee in the same little shop where we'd first shared the truth about Howard and Brooks. She'd become one of the youngest detectives in the city, and her determination to clean up the department from the inside hadn't dimmed. We talked about cases, about the ongoing investigations into officers connected to the photo-sharing ring, and sometimes about the toll it took to keep fighting. There was an unspoken understanding between us. We had both seen the worst of the system, and we had both decided it was still worth saving. Outside of work, life was quieter. My mother had finally stopped asking me to move back home, though she still called every evening just to check. The apartment I'd moved into after the break-in felt safe in a way the old one never could. Cameras in the hallways, a doorman who knew my name, neighbors who nodded in greeting. I'd built small rituals into my day's morning coffee on the balcony, evening walks, when the streets were busy enough to feel alive, but not threatening. As I wrapped up my opening statement in court that day, I caught sight of a juror leaning forward, listening intently. It reminded me why I had come back to this work. Justice isn't swift and it isn't perfect, but it is possible. It takes persistence, truth, and the refusal to be silenced. Howard and Brooks had tried to reduce me to nothing more than a bleeding woman on a sidewalk. Instead, they had handed me the fire I needed to burn through the lies and force change. Walking out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon light, I felt the familiar pull of the scar and the steady beat of my own heart. I was still here, still fighting. And as long as I was, no one else would be left to die, while the people sworn to protect them laughed. If this story moved you, made you think, or opened your eyes to the realities some people face behind closed doors, I'd love for you to be part of this journey with me. Every week, we share powerful, true stories of resilience, justice, and the fight to make things right. Stories that remind us why courage matters and why speaking up can change everything. By subscribing to the channel, turning on notifications, and joining the conversation in the comments, you're not just watching, you're helping build a community that refuses to look away. Your thoughts, your experiences, and your voice can inspire others to stand their ground, to keep fighting, even when the odds seem impossible. So, hit that subscribe button, leave a comment below, and let's keep these stories alive, because together we can make sure the truth is never silenced.